and they realized that most of most of the people were most of the churches that were growing were actually churches that were engaging in some kind of multicultural ministry, particularly in those regions in the South where they were where they did this training. Well, this research, they found out that there were churches engaged in some kind of Spanish ministry just because of the population influx. So it was interesting. I found that interesting. Also, the amount of like there was no church that did not reach the average attendance here in the U.S., which is about 77, 80, something like that.
Wow.
Well, that was. I mean, for me, doing this for the pastors, it was Maria Paiva and Ruben Duran wanted to like do a program called Redil, which with sheepfold, right? And it's interesting how little details like that can actually help church, you know, reach out and grow where it needs to grow.
Yeah, and it's also amazing how the information is out there if you spend the time to look for it, right?
Yeah.
For a lot of people, it's kind of like a mystery of. I feel like there's a lot of times when people maybe just try to think they have to like solve a lot of the problems on their own, and so I appreciate that there's research out there and that there's some kind of tangible plot points for things that work, and I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, collaboration, I think is key. It was there were about 50 or so between pastors and mission developers. There were English speakers, so they provided translation. For the first time, they were providing translation for the English speakers in this case. So, and what I find remarkable is the fact that, you know, we were able to put together this large group of people and share, and then we divided kind of like, you know, some of the things that you have done with people in smaller groups and have conversations, and even smaller groups. And it was very powerful, like some of the stories and that people have about ministry and how rewarding it can be if it's going to be hard, right? Because we're really going against there's the, you know, racism, bigotry, you know, all the isms, anti-LGBTQI plus, anti-immigrant, all those sentiments are out there. And how to create a church that is actually inclusive for really everyone. That's going to be the challenge, but it's worth taking the challenge. And I think what they found is that study that the church is going down, we're the ones not even engaging in those.
Ooh. Well, that's a good way to start our formal conversation. I'll do the introduction. If you were listening to the beginning part, you get to know why this important conversation is happening. Hello, everyone. I'm Pastor Megan Rohrer. I'm the pastor at Grace Lutheran in San Francisco. This is, I think, our 18th week now of doing listening town halls every Friday. And for those who are joining us on the Zoom webinar, if you haven't used Zoom before, just the speakers today have video and voice. That's to help folk who have a harder time securing Wi-Fi to be able to get a better picture, but it's also to try to decrease the likelihood that someone will intentionally interfere with the conversation that we're trying to center. And if you would like to post up questions for Pastor Nelson to answer throughout our conversation, you can put them in the Q&A section below. The chat section, feel free to add any sort of comments that you want to share as a community. It's easier to find the questions though if you put them in the Q&A. If you are watching on Facebook Live, you can just type any questions right in the comments and I'll check them out there. As we begin our time of chatting together, I try to remind people that technology problems is a thing that happens, it's natural and it's normal, and also that those who are sharing their thoughts and their feelings in this new world where we pay attention to video live streams and the archives of them, that I offer up in this space permission for both of us to speak from our own personal experience, but not have to speak for everyone else who might have shared identities with us. And also to give ourselves grace to be human beings in this moment. So the wisdom we carry right now might not be the best language and wisdom that's needed in 4 more years, but in September 25th of 2020, it was the best wisdom we had today. And so we're going to be people who grow and change, and hopefully you'll remember that in whatever time frame that you watch this video. Pastor Nelson, would you be willing to introduce yourself and maybe some of the intersections that you embody to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Pastor Reverend Megan. So my name is Nelson Rabell Gonzalez. I am from Puerto Rico, was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I came to the U.S. back in '98 for my seminary career, seminary studies at the time, the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, today part of the United Lutheran Seminary. It has both, the Gettysburg and Philadelphia campuses. So they merged, and now there's the ULS. I am what you might call Afro-Caribbean, which that means is that I have a lot in my family. We have a strong African descent presence. The slaves that were brought to Puerto Rico starting in the early 1600s throughout the history of our colonization by the Spanish Empire at the time. The native people in Puerto Rico were called the Taínos. They were decimated by the 1600s. They estimated about 10% of the population survived. Puerto Rico is about an island that is 100 miles long and about 33 miles wide, so it was not a huge territory. So the illnesses and the forced labor that were forced upon them, along with just a genocide in general, that the Spanish conquistadores utilized to dominate the people, particularly the native Taínos, decimated the population. So basically by the 1800s, to give you some numbers, Puerto Rico was basically had a larger population of African descent or people who were mixed between European and African descent. Our DNA, and there were still little enclaves of people who were direct descendants from native people, but literally it was a stronger influence in our culture, even our makeup and how we look. It is very strongly from Mother Africa in that sense. So I'm a Lutheran pastor, as you might assume, and I was ordained in 2002. When I started, when I finished my seminary career, went back to Puerto Rico, and then was a pastor of a congregation for about 2 years. My spouse is both a dentist and an epidemiologist, so she got a job offer back in the States. So we, after 2 years of a parish ministry in Puerto Rico, we went back to Philadelphia, and then there. I got called to, I was called to a congregation in Southern Jersey, Apostles Lutheran Church. If they're watching, still love you guys. Wonderful community of faith in the southern part of New Jersey, about 20 miles south of Philadelphia. And so I have 2 kids. I say kids, but they're adults now, 21 and 19. My son, Iram, is 21. My daughter, Sophia, is 19. And before that, my background is in engineering. I was a mechanical engineer. I used to work for Motorola in the manufacturing process of pagers and cell phones in the beginning, say mid to late 90s, when the beginning of that industry. And we had the largest factory of pagers of Motorola was in Puerto Rico. And that's the one I used to work for a few years before I went to Philly for theological education. So when I went back to Puerto Rico, I started an STM while I was still doing my MDiv, so I was able to finish it. I did it in Bible and Luther, kind of like Lutheran theology and Bible. And then now I'm currently working on my DMin at Garrett Seminary. It's in homiletics and the Latinx experience. So it's a new program. It's a joint effort between the UMC, the United Methodist Church, and the ELCA. So they kind of like selected us to do this. So there's 7 of us. There's only one person who's Baptist who's part of the cohort. But there's 3 Lutherans and 3 Methodists. 3 are from Puerto Rico, and the other 3 are actually from the U.S. And it's interesting, 2 Mexicans, 1 Colombian, 3 Puerto Ricans, and there's only 2 women, sadly. And so yeah, that's kind of like the makeup of this group, of this cohort. Because we had to pay for half of it. The scholarship was half, but we had to come up with the other half, and so not everybody obviously can afford that, which is a reality in theological studies. So anyway, I talked too much. That's kind of like a general.
No, that's a lot of great, fascinating stuff, and I'm really excited that this cohort is happening. I think there's a lot of really creative stuff happening in seminaries right now, trying to explore new ways to, one, do better theology as a church in general, and better, more just ways to have faithful education move forward. So I'm grateful that they have that.
Yeah, no, it's been interesting, been challenging. I think, as you know, in your own experience, the church can be, even the seminary setting, and this is a UMC seminary, Garrett over in Evanston. We have had as a cohort a lot of challenges, but I think the fact that we have seen that we are a unified group facing.
Movie, Michaela. Room, door closed now, dude. Come on. Sorry.
No, don't worry. And so we have this opportunity to do this, but at the same time, it shows you kind of like COVID-19, the unveiling of the fractures within an institution, be it a church institution or government or society in general, the fractures and the blind spots and the blind sides of institutions trying to do the right thing. I'm not, in that sense, being completely negative or dismissive of their efforts, but at the same time, it shows you how much more and the road we have ahead of us we still have road to go. And for many different issues, but in this one in particular, bringing a cohort of Spanish speakers, and which are not all necessarily fluent in English, which was the reason behind this project, tells you how far we have to go in terms of seminary education for emerging, kind of like our team program, theological education for emerging ministries. How can we create opportunities, but also make it not only accessible financially, but at the same time, an experience that can be both inspiring, refreshing, can renew the person in their faith and commitment and mission vocation, but to make it in a way that attracts people to do it. Great challenge ahead.
Yeah, it's as challenging as having kids at homeschool who want to chat in the hallway while you do a live stream, but thank you.
Yeah.
What I appreciate about that though is that it feels sort of like investing in the work that you're doing from kind of a systemic level or from an academic level. I mean, I don't want to use the language of like trickle down, because I know so much of that has been problematic in terms of making really difficult economies for people. But I really do see the way that our church as a whole investing in your education and the education of this cohort then helps a whole community kind of forge its own path. And particularly some of the work that you're doing with the migrant community right now, some of the work that you're up to in Lodi with kind of organizing and justice work, for me is particularly inspiring. And so I'm grateful that even if it's through like a half scholarship in something, that there's a way in which our institution is investing in this work. Would you be willing to tell people about some of that work that you're doing?
No, thank you, Pastor Megan, for that. It's interesting. When I came here 2.5 years ago, I really did not think that I was gonna have to do all this type of work, to be honest. Not in terms of the migrant work, working with migrants and advocating for them, but I really did not know how, in this region in particular of California. Remember, I lived almost 20 years in the Northeast, in Philadelphia for 5 years and 13, almost 14 years in South Jersey. So my experience of racism is a Northeastern experience, which is very different. Obviously, there's still racism, but not as, I would say, as pervasive, well, not pervasive, but in your face, as I have seen it here in this region of California. Lodi is a small town, about 67,000 people. It has a history of being a sundown town. That's why the African-American population here is less than 2%. I have heard histories of when African-Americans they knew at 6 o'clock, you gotta go. And the shots being fired to remind you of that. And the KKK gatherings in the north side of Stockton, marching over to Lodi. There's a long history of racism. So when I came here, I was shocked by Lodi. And I don't think sometimes people realize, for those of us living in Philadelphia, where it's a diverse city, and then coming to Lodi, which should be diverse because 40% of the population is Latinx. And there's a growing population of Pakistani and people from, mostly Pakistani, some from India, but mostly Pakistani. It should have a different mindset. But the truth is that there's a lot of work to do. And so part of the work that I have been doing, not by virtue of my initial calling, my calling was to create a ministry for the Spanish-speaking community here in Lodi. But as I started doing that ministry and I saw the intersections between racism towards the African-American community, the lack of support for the LGBTQI plus community, which is, I'll give you an example related to that work in particular. There's a march that is done here every year. It's called the Peace March, a peace walk. And it was being basically led by, a church that is super conservative. And initially, that was not the idea. We were supposed to, everybody was welcome to participate. But before I got here, they kind of like took over a little bit. And they did not invite, for example, the LGBTQI plus community to be a part of it. And that was the idea behind it. Like all groups, all vulnerable communities to kind of like showcase themselves as a united front against racism and bigotry. So I had to advocate very strongly within different groups that were part of that march to remove this church from being and I'll say the name, I don't have a problem. It was First Baptist Church over here in Lodi. And they don't have a good history with the LGBTQI plus community, period. I believe St. Paul and St. Paul Lutheran, where I serve, the Presbyterian Church and the UMC to some degree, and also the Episcopal Church here, St. John the Baptist Episcopal Church, are the only churches that are LGBTQ friendly. Just to give you an example, the rest are not. And that was one of the first struggles that we had. And it cost me a lot of friends. But we were able to do it. But that, along with the lack of concern for the LGBTQI plus community, was the fact that migrants was, that's where intersection comes in. it's like a package. When you have an ideology of hate, it's like a whole package. It's like a pill that says, you swallow it, and all those, hates towards this, toward that, here, there. And I think that was part of the problem, that the group of people that well-intentioned, but they had a lot of blind spots in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And I have to say, very wonderful group of people, but they were actually somewhat liberal, mostly Caucasian, and older. And I'm saying older, above 50 and 60. Well-intentioned, but they could not see those. It was as if they were stuck in somewhat in the 70s, but not truly aware of everything that has happened since the 70s. Does that make sense?
Yep. I feel like I've met those people before. Yeah.
Wonderful people, but the
Yeah.
truth is, it's challenging.
Yeah, and it's too bad they weren't stuck a decade earlier, because things would make more sense, right? Because the 60s kind of jive a little bit more for the like conversations about what hair is appropriate, like gender conversations were a part of the kind of culture, and conversations about what pieces was a part of the culture, and conversations about racism and the civil rights. At least it would be maybe easier for folk to be stuck in that era. But I think it's an interesting context, particularly to be a pastor who embodies so many different intersections, right? Because if the culture or the flavor of the location that you're in is seemingly the same, right? Where people seem the same in their outward lives. We know enough as pastors to know in their inner lives and what's really going on in their families, there's probably a lot of diversity, but at least in the way they're acting on the sidewalks and at rallies or protests, there's kind of this idea that things are kind of the same. And so what is it like to be a pastor in a community like that, right? Because it's not like you can, your differences, some of them are on the exterior of your body, right? And so what has that been like for you?
I think I was the first Latinx pastor in Turnersville, New Jersey, when I was called to apostles back in 2005. And I remember, the loneliness in the sense of being literally the only pastor of, I'm not exaggerating, Pastor Megan, the only pastor of color in a town of about close to 35,000 people. They have about half of what Lodi is, but obviously surrounded with closer to larger cities like Philadelphia. I was on about 15 minutes from Philly. So, but still, like that sense of loneliness is real. And when you do ministry, the people embrace you. No doubt. I think that's a beauty of ministry. Not always, and not everyone. But my experience was that in those first few years, I did lose a lot of people. And I have to say it. I think it's fair to say that not everybody was happy having a Spanish-speaking pastor. And I want to tell you a story about that. So I went to this home of a World War II veteran. He and his spouse were alive, both of them. He had cancer. He was in the last stages. He still could move, but he was fragile. So I went to give him communion. And I, started service, give him communion. At the end, after I had communion, you stay, you have a conversation with both of them. And I never forget what his spouse said to me. She said to me, "We never wanted a Spanish-speaking pastor in our church." It was right after I had given them communion. And I remember, those who know me know the buttons that I have, and that's one of them. Obviously, attacking my identity, racism, any kind of oppression. And I remember feeling I had to use every ounce of my pastoral training, every ounce of my faith, my patience, my discipline, to lovingly say, well, here I am. Think I'll be on my way now, and blessings. I hope that mention the name of her husband, and blessings to both. If you need me, you have my phone. I'll try to schedule another appointment. Remember heading to the car and grabbing the the wheel and just driving off. And you go through that, and I think at that moment, I remember thinking, before that happened, you go, with all the, you go with the love, you go with the faith, you go with the spirit of service and you think, I'm breaking barriers, I'm going to their home. And you really have all of that in your heart, in your mind. You know you're breaking barriers. But when that is said to you, like in such a blatant way, you are reminded of all the walls that we create between us. And it can be devastating. I think I remember it took me probably about 2 weeks to get back on my on my groove and get my mojo back.
Yeah, I've been in similar circumstances. Obviously, mine are more about being a queer pastor, being a trans pastor, being a pastor who worked with the homeless. I actually showed up to preach, because when I was working with the homeless, I would preach at different congregations every Sunday, and I've actually had 2 different congregations threaten to call the police on me while I was waiting there, because I was their preacher for the day. Like, they knew I was coming. And for one of the congregations, it was they just didn't expect someone young would come to their church, I think. And one of the congregations thought I was a homeless person, right? And I was in my clergy collar. But the vision of who they had as their pastor, right? And I was there because I just thought, if I show up early, they won't have to worry if I'm coming or not. So it was just, it's been a very interesting, it's always interesting to preach after that happens. Makes people real nervous before the sermon. But there is a way in which my theory as a pastor has been number one, I hope in those moments that my face doesn't say what I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. And my theory has been to just try to love people enough for the both of us. I'm going to love them enough that they have some to share back at me. And that's not my recommendation in a friendship, but it's a pastor thing that we do. And so I have this kind of thick skin in my pastor world that I can be your pastor even if you don't like the way my body is. Because I also think that's the gift of my favorite thing about biblical scripture is that it's so diverse that people who are going to spend their whole life preaching the opposite of me theologically, that's their book too, right? That's their God too. And so that for me is proof of God's love and existence, because human beings wouldn't have made the world that way. They wouldn't have made the world for such radically diverse people to be loved by the same thing. And so for me, I feel comfortable being in those spaces in a pastor way, but I think you're right in pointing out that then there's yourself, the real person who goes to therapy or figures people you can vent to, or works it out of your system for a couple of months or years to try to shed some of that. And so I'm appreciative that you're talking about that in sort of a public forum, because I think there's a lot of pastors who don't know and maybe wonder if they're not good at being a pastor because they have those private feelings that are different than their public pastor feelings. And have you seen ways that individuals have decreased their bias? Like, have you seen things that people have done that has been hopeful? Because times like this feel less hopeful because everything feels so big, right?
Yeah, even in that story, let me say this. This family did not leave. I did bury the husband, um, her spouse when he died, and she left when it was time to go to her retirement home. So you could tell there was a tension. Not so much, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not a person who holds a grudge forever. I was not taught to be that. Not obviously, it's part of what you were referring to, therapy. How to decompress and detox in order to be a pastor. But also, it's not in my DNA. That I'm not wired like that. I think the most important thing I learned from that experience is that you have, and this I learned from Pastor Reverend Dr. Charles Leonard. He is, I did my part of my internship with him in Philadelphia. He's an African-American pastor in North Philly. And he always told us, all the students, but especially when I was his vicar, you have to love the people. And I remember he was in charge at the time in seminary. He was in charge of the contextual education, still is to this day, and in Philadelphia at the Lutheran Seminary in Philly. And that first year, I was sent to an African-American church in South Philly, Emmanuel Lutheran Church. And that was the best experience ever. And then the second year, I wanted to stay there. He said, no, I'm going to send you to a rural community in Coopersburg, Pennsylvania. And I had a wonderful experience too, different, no doubt. I saw the good, the sublime, the ugly, and the bad. So I saw it all. And I think it tells you that people are complicated. People are complicated. I never forget this, what you might consider today maybe a typical Trump supporter, which obviously, has some connotations politically and in terms of, I'd say, biases. Every Sunday, he would give me $20, say, Vicar Nelson, this is for gas, anything you need. It was funny. His name was Luther. And I tough guy, and I was a little afraid of him, but he, so again, people are complicated sometimes. And I think how to appeal to the better angels, if you will, even of people that may have some issues with you for whatever reason, sexual orientation, ethnicity, immigration status, class, so many isms that we have in our world, and how to appeal to whatever is creating at that moment that you're experiencing with them, that's compassion and mercy, to extract it even more, if you will, so that they can use more of that. Wherever they get that formula of compassion, hey, can you fill that up again with a little bit more this time? Maybe you could include another group of people, maybe not all at the same time, but at least one more, please. So I think there's a sense in which we can do that, right? Try to do that. The other thing is, you were asking me before about my work with the migrant population. What I have found is that a lot of people, when you tell them about the reality they experience every day, how they are essential workers, and I've seen this in Trump supporters, in super progressive people, and middle of the road type of people, they get it. they may come still to the conclusion, well, they came here illegally, this and that, and give you that that position or that statement, but they get it, at least from a human point of view. They get the why we need to be supportive. And I think there's a little glimmer of hope there. And the last one I want to tell you is interesting, related to migrants, but it was in New Jersey. It was in a Senate assembly, and we were passing a resolution in support of comprehensive immigration reform. This was a few years ago, back when this was a big discussion. Should we do or not do comprehensive immigration reform in the country? And there was a big debate about it. And I remember this man who stood up and was very against any resolution for migrants that would, lead the country into comprehensive immigration reform. And he sat down. And then a migrant that was in West New York, who was attending a church, a Lutheran church in West New York, stood up. And his pastor translated, because his pastor was a bilingual pastor, who, by the way, was a Caucasian pastor, Pastor Johansson. He was listening, blessings. He translated for him. And this migrant was telling the whole assembly his story. The man who was against the resolution stood up and publicly, and if Maricela Freiberg, Moacir, and some of my colleagues from New Jersey are seeing this, please, validate my story. This is not a made-up story. Wayne, all of you who are listening, please validate this story, because that was one of the few times that I've seen what you were referring to, that moment. And he came, with tears in his eyes, and he changed his vote, and he acknowledged that he was wrong. To this day, it brings tears to my eyes to see that, to remember that, you see the possibilities of what love can do. But it was powerful, the story, it was the migrant told his story, and that changed their hearts. So I think the glimmer of hope that I see, I'm sorry taking so long to say this, but I think it's in listening to our stories, listening to our pain, our joys, our hopes, our dreams. That's where conversion happens, daily conversion. So we need, just like we, in a ritual way, we do the remembrance of baptism, we need to do this daily as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that story. And if you wonder if you're talking too long, the answer is never going to be no in this conversation, if only because the Holy Spirit is playing a joke on us right now. My children are still singing after I asked them to stop a lot of times, and the neighbors started doing construction on the other side of that wall. So
it's good. It's good.
I know it's good, but but for me, like, what I have learned maybe in my time on this earth is that people change, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Again, growing up in South Dakota, there were a lot of people. I came out around the time where Matthew Shepard died. Yeah. And right. And that was kind of a really big time of talking about LGBTQ stuff in our country. But what I know now, right, as a 40-year-old that I didn't know as a 20-year-old, is that every single one of those people who was cruel to me has apologized.
Oh, good.
Like, right? And so even the folk who had just sort of missed the mark a little bit, I still get emails or letters of people who are like, I did this thing and I'm sorry it hurt you. And honestly, a lot of it is stuff I don't even remember. But what it has reminded me is that even if you have one splinter of time with someone, and in that moment, they're carrying a bias, whether they know they have that bias or not. What we don't know yet is what happens next month or next year, or where that unraveling starts to take place. And I think we have big moments where it feels like the world gets clogged like a messy toilet, and some of those biases seem more obvious. And maybe we're less loud during the moments when it releases, and people learn lessons. Maybe we don't celebrate as much when that happens because there's always another justice we're waiting for and demanding. But I think lifting up those moments where someone changes is really important for what's going on in our society right now. I think that story at a synod assembly is a beautiful moment. I wish more people had the courage to acknowledge in a microphone when they have changed their mind, right? Yeah. In scripture, some of my favorite verses are the lines that say, and then God changed God's mind, right? Because you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
If God can change how God feels about Nineveh, maybe I can change my mind about how I feel about whatever, or I can be someone who learns and changes and grows. And so there's something beautiful about noticing that if we notice that's possible in other people, then it's got to be possible in me.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Pastor Megan. One of my favorite words in Greek is kenosis, from Philippians chapter 2. I believe it's verse 7. The emptying of Jesus, the ability of Jesus to do not hold on to the power of the divine in order to create a system of domination toward humanity. Even though we ask the kingdom of God to come, the kingdom of God, and I say K-I-N, kingdom, our kingdom, the kingdom of God comes to not to dominate, but to save and serve. And Jesus is the embodiment of that kingdom. So, but the emptying, which is, I think it's, when you think about it theologically, is quite powerful to think that the divine, which is the affirmation that Christianity makes, dwells in this marginalized peasant Jew from Palestine, a territory at the time of the Roman Empire. And the fullness of the deity dwells in this marginality, in this, marginal person, which I think, but that marginality creates possibilities for the whole world to be saved.
Yeah.
And precisely because the power then, even though there's displays of power, resurrection, miracles, forgiveness of sins, and et cetera, but the power displayed was a power of service to the neighbor. And specifically, when you look at the stories, and I'm preaching here to the choir, but I always like those stories where Jesus is reaching out, like this Sunday's gospel. Jesus tells the religious people of his time, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are ahead of you in the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
Right? And I was explaining on my Bible study in Spanish, I said, what is Jesus really saying here? And I said, he's saying what he's really saying. That's exactly what he's saying. And people are like, what? Yes. If you think about the hypocrisy of all of us, to think that we are no need, like, us as clergy or anyone for that matter, to think that you're better than someone because that person is experiencing life from marginality, and you don't have compassion, mercy, understanding, and wish that person the best. But you use your position in life, which is, I think, the kenosis part. You use your position in life to say, I'm better than you. That's where we miss Philippians chapter 2. And I think we miss the cross, and we miss what the resurrection really means. The resurrection is the validation, the affirmation of the way Jesus lived, including those words. So,
and if I remember correctly, I think Philippians 2 also is one of the texts that tells us we have to listen to others as a
Yes.
part of our being Christians. And that's not something Jesus goes into it's what Jesus does, but it's not something that's explicitly stated in the Gospels. And so I love that Philippians 2 is like, and you're going to listen to each other.
That's right.
Because that's where you're going to build your compassion, and that's where you're going to kind of like unfold all of this lifestyle. And
Yeah.
I confess too that I've used the text about the sex workers and the tax collectors will go to heaven before you. For me, has always been one of the best responses to people who think that God agrees with their naughty or nice list, right? Yeah. That God doesn't like those people, but does like those people, like whoever is on whatever list that people are talking about, whether it's, liberal lists or conservative lists or anywhere in between. This idea that none of your lists are going to make sense, because if the sex workers go ahead of you, like, what, right? Yep. Like, and I think that's part of the beauty of it is Jesus never asks anyone to vote on who God should love. Jesus isn't like, should we go to Samaria? Let's go to Samaria, right? Jesus is just always opening things bigger and crossing borders without the stops in the paperwork. And not saying who doesn't go to heaven. Like Jesus, like that's not a part of Jesus's sayings. We've all memorized who's not going to heaven, but says over and over and over. I think there are more times in scripture that Jesus says sex workers will go to heaven than any other population that Jesus is talking about. And we just couldn't say for sure what exactly that means. And I think that's really lovely, right?
Yeah. But our sense of our lack of kenosis is such that we want to hold on to that list you mentioned, like because we want to be on the list, but by the way, it's the list we create. It's not the list that God seems to have, where everyone seems to be included, including the ones that I think it's a matter of powerlessness. Like when you look at in some respects, Jesus uses those two examples. You have prostitutes who completely powerless, but the tax collectors are not necessarily powerless, but they are traitors to the nation, and they're doing it to survive, and they're doing it in many ways. So if you put yourself in those shoes, what would you do? You have to survive. What would you do? Like, I remember listening to a migrant member of my congregation telling me about some of the things that migrant workers have to do to survive. I've listened to the stories of when they're coming from either Mexico, Honduras, and what they go through to get here. I've seen pictures of little kids who have been in my parish, who are in my parish, and what they experienced in migrant camps right across from the border in Matamoros, Mexico, waiting to go on to the other side. And when you think about, if you have created a list, we're doing that, and just let's change, prostitute, let's change, tax collector with any other group that we put down, right? Then what are we really saying about who God is? And I think that's the problem. We are the problem. I always try to convey that to people who have issues with the church, and rightly so. I validate all their issues. I hear you, but I think it's up to us as clergy, as Christians, as people of faith, to be honest, and in a way, imagine Jesus saying that text for Sunday, which is what we supposedly do every Sunday. Listen to Jesus, and remove any pretension on our part, which is hard to do. I granted, it's we're human, we're not perfect, but the moment we start creating a false, I call it an idol. We create idols that require victims, and we need to sacrifice them on that altar, on the altar of my sense of security, you know? So be it the migrants, the community that has a different sexual orientation than mine, the LGBTQI plus community, African Americans, we have seen that quite clearly that, well, for more than 200 years, but with a cell phone, we have seen it on our computers, on our cell phones, almost live. And we're still trying to create this sense of false security that is based on an idol that requires victims. That we need that I think is the real problem. We are creating an idol that requires victims to be sacrificed. And I think I agree 100% with some of the calling that Lenny Duncan is doing to the whole church to kind of like work against this system that requires victims from all different walks of life. But unless we put a stop to that, I think the church will not be able to have a profound impact and be relevant in what's going on today.
Yeah, and then I think that was a large part of what was going on in the Reformation too. Mm-hmm. Luther talked about that a lot by talking about how, like in Lent, for example, there were all these rituals that you had to do with people living in poverty, right? Mm-hmm. So you had to be able to go give money to the poor. Mm-hmm. Well, Luther said that's a dumb thing we're not going to do anymore. And not because giving to the poor isn't an important part of our faith, but because we don't want to be people who need the poor. Mm-hmm. We don't want to have to need people to be at a substandard level of life mm-hmm. in order for me to go and live out my faith.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that work might have been done on economics, and maybe that's why even Lutherans who don't think I should ever be on either side of a communion table will be able to agree with me and support work I do with the poor and the homeless, because we can get along when it comes to like justice issues and working on poverty. We're really good at that. I think that comes from Luther. And so it would make sense if we could find a way to have that same conversation about how the church has needed victims in all the categories it needed victims in order to kind of progress forward and be able to kind of keep moving or to be relevant in people's lives. I think that's a really interesting way to think about what church is now and how church structures can change. Do you have thoughts about how like a church-wide system or a synodical system could decrease their bias in really intentional ways? We've been trying to collect ideas from as many synods and as many people as possible, but if you have any we sometimes get bishops watching, and so right? I mean, reparations might be the answer, but I just thought I'd see if there's any more that you
I think
pass on to people.
Yeah, Lenny has talked about that. Pastor Lenny Duncan, and I think I agree 100%. What I would add, if you will, my 2 cents on that conversation, is that intentionality is not just a word. Intentionality means that you need to create a real, let me put it this way. When you have a board, or you have a group of people, a steering committee, if that steering committee does not have real authority, it's symbolic, and everything that is said is kind of like a resolution that no one remembers that was passed. That's part of the problem that I see. So I think the ELCA, speaking specifically about the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, you and I have been parts of conversations where one of the things that all the vulnerable people in the ELC are trying to convey is that we need a way to make the church accountable to what the church is really trying to achieve. If the presiding bishop, if bishops, if synodical councils even church councils don't have some kind of accountability to each other in terms of reaching out the goals that we're talking about, which is, and we're talking about a very basic thing. We're talking about anti-bias, right? And anti-racism, and truly working in an intentional way to create structures that do not reflect white supremacy and or any kind of bias against any group, vulnerable group, sexual orientation, ageism, ableism, all the isms that all the walls that we create against each other. So that requires intentional work. That's not going to be a resolution that gets it done. It's going to require a lot of conversations like the one you and I are having, like the one hopefully the Conference of Bishops is having at the church-wide level, at the congregational level. But if we don't have an accountability, like if there's no way for the congregations hold the synod accountable, and vice versa, and we have to put in that mix of church-wide council, we need to create a structure where we are all accountable to each other related to this goal that we have to create a church, to foster a church culture, a church environment that is free of bias, free of racism, free of homophobia. I mean, there's so many, and the truth is, Megan, and I'll be quite honest about this. I think that we need to be ready to, we were talking about kenosis before, right? We need to be ready to maybe lose membership, powers, even influence, and maybe a few institutions. Because maybe we won't be the church that we're today, but if you look at the numbers of the congregations that are in this environment, growing or moving ahead in their membership, are the ones that are doing some kind of multicultural, multi-ethnic, inclusive to the LGBTQI plus community. Those are the churches that are moving ahead. So they're moving ahead with what the vast majority of people in this country believe to be fair and just. So if we in the church do not create that same type of possibility, or a culture, a structure that reflects or fosters that type of environment, I think that we're going to be stuck in what we have right now. And sadly, we may actually continue to lose membership and institutions, closing churches, etc. But it will be for the wrong reasons. It's better to do it for the right reasons and then come back up. I think that's a problem that we're afraid of going one way or the other because we're afraid we're losing. We're losing as it is. So
yeah, and I'm going to try to be careful how I word this, but as a pastor who has been called to a congregation who lost a lot of membership because they weren't able to adjust and be diverse, to be a pastor who comes after it's almost hopeless to come and try to then change the world around, it's just really disappointing that we're not able to make some of those statements out loud earlier, right? Before the resources dwindle, and then those who go and have the courage to try to reroute things in a different direction oftentimes ends up without the same amount of support. And so I like kind of the honesty that sometimes shifting means adjusting and reorienting and that life, death, and resurrection stuff that churches ought to be good at, but maybe sometimes we're not. And I think you might have something there. We did get a question from one of our watchers who wants to learn more about what you were talking about when you were talking about the church maybe needing victims and wanting to change that model. They were curious about what it meant to you when you use the term victim.
Oh, no, I don't mean, let me just clarify. I
Yeah.
don't mean the church. I mean society and society's sins requiring victims. Now, what the church does sometimes is silent and is a co-participant, or you might say a collaborator, but it's not, I don't want to pin that just on the church because that's not real. It's not the truth. This is actually language that comes from liberation theology. Ignacio Lacuria, John Sobrino, Gustavo Gutierrez. There's a sense in which we talk about systems devouring people, and hatefulness devours people. So in that sense, that's where, when you think about what systemic racism does, what homophobia does, is that it requires people to be hated in order to function. So the only way we can counter that is by not hating and not promoting hate, and actually countering that system and not providing any more victims. And so I know the language, some people get a little uncomfortable, but the idea when liberation theologians did it, I'm not saying we cannot, revisit the language, but when I study it, there were many of them, particularly in Ignacio Lacuria, Spanish Jesuit priest who was during the Salvadoran Civil War through 1980s up to 1992 or so, 12 years of war. What he said was, at the moment when he said it, people were being killed, literally. Priests were being killed, women were being disappeared, kids, massacres, death squads. It was a very, he used a language of you might say, death devouring systems, right? And I think I'm very against trying to sanitize language sometimes, in the sense of, and just like I always like to wear a crucifix with the body on it, because I think we and this is something that comes more from obviously my Latinx background, but also the fact that I think our culture here in North America, we want to sanitize everything. You cannot sanitize racism, just like you cannot sanitize homophobia. You need to speak about it just the way it really is. Because what happens is that we try to soften the blow. And from your experiences, my experiences, the experiences of African-American women, African-American, people of color in general, Native Americans, the LGBTQI plus community, immigrants, when you look at their experience, there's nothing to be sanitized. You can't. If you do, then we're not listening to their story. And it needs to be as real as it can be, or the effect on us and the call to conversion to stop, and I'll use the language again with all intention. If we don't do that, we will keep providing victims to a system that requires them. And we need to stop that. We need to stop being the feed, the conveyor of victims, as a church, as a society, as a world. And I think that's the call to work for the kingdom of God. When we ask for the kingdom of God to come, that's what we're really asking to end. That life-hindering, life-devouring systems that we human beings have created, and that require so much death around us. And how to speak of hope in the middle of that, that is the power of the gospel. Because Jesus experienced a death-devouring system called the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I experienced that kind of briefly because when I was working with the homeless full time, I would spend a week each year living on the streets to live with those who were living in poverty, kind of out of that same Gustavo Gutierrez kind of model of being with folk and hearing from them rather than just creating your own programs. Yeah. And as a part of that, with a group of Franciscans, we would also go and live in Nicaragua for a couple of weeks to live with the poor there, because it gives you a different perspective of like, you thought this was poverty, homelessness in San Francisco is like mansion dwelling, right, compared to barrios in Nicaragua, or even more impoverished farm life in kind of really rural Nicaragua. And it was, they kind of came out of this experience of missing folk, but not just missing folk, but folk who went missing. You were terrified and terrorized by their going missing, and you couldn't talk about it with anyone, or you might be slaughtered in public, right? With your bloodstains being the story of how others should be terrorized. And while I was living with them, I asked if I could go to mass, because they weren't kind of in the tradition of going to church. And we have a call to common mission, which means Lutherans, when you're not near a Lutheran worship service, you can go to a Catholic service and you're allowed to share communion. And apparently a very fancy like archbishop was preaching at the cathedral that day. And it was just me. They dropped me off because they, first of all, didn't feel like they were wealthy enough to be able to even go in the church, let alone to like drop me. And I was like, let's go, like, come with me. And I wasn't gonna like force them to do something that felt above what they were allowed. But they went home and watched me on TV because the service was on TV. And they saw me go and get communion because, you know, in my Western civilized way, you go to the line of the most important person, right? I don't know if you've ever seen that. Sometimes we go to the line's always longest at the most important. So I went to the like archbishop and I took communion, and apparently I was on TV taking communion or something like. And when I came home, they had like 1,000 questions on how I could be brave enough to receive communion from this fancy religious figure, because they didn't feel brave enough because of how long they had held silent about who they were, and they were kind of living on the outskirts of non-leased land. Like they had this narrative that they didn't name themselves as victims. They didn't call it that, but it was not even in their mindset to think that they could walk through doors which were open to them. And so that's a story that helped me at least unravel part of what those theologians are talking about, kind of from that South American liberation theology mindset. Is they were trying to like provoke people to see their worth, to claim that God is theirs and not offered to them, but from the outside. But also like naming that, knowing that those people might be slaughtered if they claim their worth. And that's a very precarious place to kind of do theology from and to preach from. And thank goodness for those priests that risked assassination or were assassinated as a part of those conversations. But I think that you're right, that there's a lot of that in our US churches, of whatever the population is, of people who don't feel like they could step into a church, or if they are inside the church, don't think that they could have communion, or if they do think they could have communion, could never speak up at a council meeting. And it's not the same in any way of what that experience was, but that there are people for whom our church doesn't even know experience that level of it's not even a not feeling worthiness. It's a been down so long, been terrorized so long that this is my world, and there's this whole world that's not open to them. And so I'm grateful that you and all of the theologians in your cohort are sitting with that to like help us as a church in these parts kind of think more about that, because I don't fully have words for it, but that's just where I dipped my toe in to kind of notice it.
I think it's a wonderful, I loved listening to that story, Pastor Megan, because when I went to El Salvador back in 2001, I was about 27, 26. And I've seen poverty. I have lived somewhat in poverty, not extreme poverty, but I know what it, you know, what it's like from the Puerto Rican context. Uh, the when I went to El Salvador and I saw people living in the municipal dumps and waiting for the truck to come to get their food, that's when I realized I have never seen that type of poverty before. Because even with coming from a colony, like, you know, Puerto Rico being a colony, a territory of the U.S., and not being part of the you know, the mainland, there's poverty, no doubt. But education and, you know, was our way out for my family. And to see that, it brings you back to, I remember saying, as I was looking at this family picking up, you know, going, the whole family going through the trash, as the truck was dumping the trash, they're going through it and grabbing things and eating them. I remember saying, and I had a few colleagues of mine who went on that trip with me. It was a seminary trip. I remember saying, I will never, ever complain again about anything that has to do with comfort. I remember saying that. I was about 26, 27. And it is, I think those are stories. In many ways, that moment was telling me a story that I needed to hear. And I think that people, like in your story, when we're able to experience someone else's story, that's when at least understanding can happen. I think there's a lack of, it's a kenotic moment, like a kenosis moment for those of us who for one reason or the other, you know, privilege, be it economic, because you're male, or because you're Caucasian, or because you come from the US, the privilege that you have, you start to analyze them and realize how you have to deconstruct them in order to reach out. And I think be even, I would say, be even more human. That possibility of being in touch with that sense of that humanity, that common humanity. What would I do if I were in that situation? Well, I would probably migrate. I would, you know, do what I have to provide for my family. And I think that's where it starts. Like, you know, I think we're kind of like going back full circle. That's when change, conversion can happen. I think that's what our church needs to hear, to listen to those stories and not be shy about it. And I think our conversation needs to be honest, you know, and we have been honest, and I appreciate this opportunity you have given me, because that honesty will move the church even forward. It'll create a humane church. And you know, we're okay with the divine church, right? We got that down. Lutherans, our liturgy, our theology, we got it down, you know. But I think that humane church is only possible when we listen.
There's something about the Catholic model of church economies that speaks to me, because they use a parish model rather than a congregational model. And I get why Lutherans have a congregational model. We want to be the bosses of ourselves, except for when we don't, right? But the parish model says your ministry is this part of the map.
Yeah.
It's not the people who worship here or tithe here or, you know, have these meetings here. Your ministry is this part of the map. And so if there's a shooting in that part of the map, you go be with people and grieve with those people. And if there's a different faith that need support, you go be with people, and then you help connect them with their faith. And there's something kind of beautiful about that geography mindset that is caring for all of the people kind of within that area. And I wish that we had a slice of that or a vision of that, because I think that would help inform us, because it's kind of like what you're up to, I think, in Lodi is you're thinking about what's everyone in Lodi like, right? That peace march, like how can we care for everyone in Lodi, not just the people who come to this building sometimes in Lodi, and even thinking who might come here next, right? Who are the next people who are going to travel here that are going to need care from us in this part of the map. And there is maybe something beautiful in the fact that pastor job descriptions and constitutions, at least in the Lutheran Church, it has like 12 things you're supposed to do, and only 4 of them talk about what you're supposed to do in your building. Right? This idea that most of what you do is supposed to not be in your building. But we don't always get there, right? It's that economic part where we can't always get there. Have you seen congregations do things that has helped them to expand and to decrease bias within their worlds?
Before I speak of St. Paul, in New Jersey, back at Apostles Lutheran Church, it was interesting. We were about, in any given Sunday, we were about 30% non-white. And we were like a mid-sized church, 100, 120. And I think what that says is that I think optics help, no doubt. I mean, there's not, having a person of color as a pastor of this town. I was the only one. Turnersville was 90% Caucasian. 90%. You can look it up. 90% Caucasian, 5% Jewish. So it was 5%. Really between African Americans, Latinx, and Asians, and we had a large contingent of people from India. Well, not large, but like in that 5%. Because I remember I was a soccer coach for many of the years, more than 10 years that I lived here in Township and in Washington Township, Turnersville. So I was able to see the kids, right? I taught, I was a coach for little kids and all the way through teenage years. And what was interesting about that is that the church, the congregation, to your question, when people started to come to us, this couple in particular, let me just say one couple in particular was interesting. There's many stories like this, but this one in particular. So Bernadette and Hassan, Bernadette was from Iraq and Hassan was from Syria. And they're Roman Catholic and they lived in Lebanon. But they moved to New Jersey. They ended up in our church. And there were like 4 huge Catholic churches in Washington Township, because it was mainly the vast majority of the population in Washington Township, Turnersville, was mostly Italians that came from Southern Philadelphia. Like one of the nicknames for Washington Township was South Philly. Because we were literally, here's Philadelphia in the southern south, about 16 miles, that's where the township was. And I remember them coming and they told me why they liked staying with us, because they could approach the priest, the pastor. They felt that this was like a family. And this is something interesting. I think we need to move away from the model of huge congregations. I'll tell you why. They show me pictures of their priest over in Lebanon. It was a parish of about 100 people. Everybody knew each other. And they, it was a different model. And the other churches were like hundreds of families, like huge. There was no familiarity. There was no, social exchange. It was, you're a number. Get in the line to maybe take communion from the important priest in front of you if you get the chance. And I think that was powerful for me because that helped the congregation to see diversity within its own, like, near, and they were embraced by, I cannot tell you how many times we went to their home and we had a couple support group. We went to their home. That was like our place. Because they wanted to showcase their hospitality. And it transformed that church, a little church in the middle of a 90%, Caucasian town. It transformed me as well. So I think there's stories like that. We need to rethink what we want to, what kind of church we want to be. I don't think that the traditional models that we have been using until today have been working, and we need to just be honest about it. Say, well, this is not working anymore. What new models can we use? And that honesty will give us life. But if we keep holding on to what we used to be, or what we used to have, or the way we used to do things, we're not seeing what's around us. And so I think that helps congregations to become, I don't like to use the word families in the sense of, because it can be exclusive, but a community that is open to other people joining. And I think that's where we need to be, and to be intentional about trying to be that place for everyone. Truly, not all are welcome, and then it's just a little slogan we put somewhere, But it's hard. It's hard work. I'm not going to deny that, Pastor Megan. It is hard work. You may lose people. You may lose power. You may lose funding. You may lose even influence. But eventually, the growth does happen. That has been my experience. So I don't know if that helps, but
no, it's a good affirmation for pastors who have been trudging through this work, mm-hmm. who so many times there are people who look to numbers in the pews for signs of success, and very rarely do we check out like the quality and the how that assembled community is living out the embodied love of Jesus in the world, kind of as we rank congregations. And my hunch is that to have more people to kind of like name that out loud is helpful for those who are doing the work.
Yeah.
But it's hard, right? And it feels hard, and it's an ever ongoing thing, right?
And I think and again, our colleagues listening, we need to get real. If the average church size, attendance in the U.S. is about 80. Mathematically speaking, if you want to argue with an engineer, I please don't. But anyway, think about it this way: the mathematics are against you in a big way if you're forcing a model that mathematically, when you look at the whole country, this is the average. And I think when pastors start talking, and usually, I have to be honest, they're usually pastors of large congregations that many of them do not really have a clear understanding of, mathematics sometimes, or the how you read data, how you interpret it. That's key. You can read it, but interpret the data. What is really telling you? So if you think, I want to have a church of 500 members, the likelihood of that is really, you're stacking all, the math is against you. It's very far and wide. That's why, most churches have 80 people attending. So we need to come up with that goal, and then If that's the average, then now you have a real metric for measuring a success that may approach reality. So just in terms of how you read data, and because putting this stress on people or pastors in particular to, you need 200 people to create a budget of, assuming 1,000 people, $1,000, you know what they do, how they come up with those numbers. They're using first the budget to create the church. It's like, no, use the math of what a church in the US looks like, and then go from there, because the other way around, you're setting up for failure. So we do have a lot of people who just don't know how to read data and how to interpret social data. And regardless of whether or not, you don't have to be an engineer to do that. What you need is a training, how to read statistics. I used to do this for Motorola. So I was trained as an engineer, but then when I went to Motorola, they trained me how to interpret data even better, because that's what I had. Part of my job was to determine the DPHU of the production lines in Motorola. The defects were 100 units. And you need to be on your toes when you're reading data and there's a big problem. Okay, where's this problem coming from? You need to analyze it. So I think when you look at the structure of the ELCA, if you're not able to determine from the get-go at the church-wide, synodical level, even for the parish, maybe our goal is not realistic. So, and I think that would save, it's kind of like removing this huge log, or like, this weight from our backs that it's not going to be real. Like, not every church, even I come from St. Paul. St. Paul worships when, around 220 in the English service, and we have had from 80 to 150, in the Spanish service. That's kind of like where we are. So that's not a model that can be replicated throughout the synod. If you're not aware of that, then you may be setting up not only pastors, but also congregations. Well, this is not real. It's not possible. It doesn't mean that it may occur every now and then, because, there are situations in particular, but I think we need to be honest about the possibilities for our congregations, so that they don't continue to try to do something and burning calories in ministries that are not gonna create more numbers. Just do it for the service that you're doing for the sake of the people that you're serving. But this may not necessarily generate more bodies in your pews. And that honesty needs to be part of our conversations. Anyway, I'm sorry I took too long, but
no, it's, again, you don't have to apologize for that. It's your time, not my time, and it's so lovely to be able to have conversations kind of on these subjects, because I think so often when we're thinking about what bias is, I think what you've kind of lifted up is the biases that we put on ourselves, maybe as faith leaders, the signs of success we're looking for, the numbers maybe that we're looking for. Yeah. I know it's like distraction central over here.
No, that's cool.
But I just like the idea that like working on resolving biases also takes us to like reorient our visioning of what, like, just because our goal is everyone goes to church every day forever doesn't mean that's a thing. And that realistic goal setting is a part of making the church more diverse, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I may, this is something, and I may get some flack from this. I went to an event, the Vitality event, that was from the ELCA, and it was actually about anchor churches. And it was interesting because the two pastors that were talking about, they both of them were Caucasian pastors from One was in Colorado, near Denver. The other one was in, I believe it was South Carolina, North Carolina. They came from areas that were, more than, we're not diverse, first of all. And the problem with the way they were talking about the ELCA doing this anchor church model, it was grounded in a reality that was not possible. It could be replicated mathematically in terms of the probability of any other church replicating what they were doing. It's one thing to talk about the relationships and this and that, but if you read carefully, if you understand and read carefully what they were trying to say, it requires so much resources. That's a part that is missing sometimes from the analysis. And that's where, and I hate to say it, but you need people with an engineering mind. You need people that knows how to really read that data. Because then, again, you're sending a message that may not be what needs to be said. It doesn't mean you don't create those relationships. Those anchor church models are great. But you need to be aware of who, how, and when and where, right? Is this model, can it be replicated in this context in the 21st century after, COVID-19? When more than 30 million people are without work and the economy is going to be decimated? I mean, those are things that we need to really think about. So again, I may get a little flack from having said that, but I say it with honesty. I say it with love, in the sense that we need to be aware of what the future holds.
Mm-hmm. And for those who haven't heard of anchor church is kind of a model. Let me know if I'm wrong about this, but anchor churches are kind of a model that the ELCA uses, where a doing well congregation, from whatever that means, sponsors another congregation that's going to go out and do a specific new type of ministry, whether it's to a cultural group or a language speaking group, or a community of color. And they're kind of anchored to this strong, vibrant community because there's resources that go either direction. And sometimes the ELCA will give money to the new growing congregation, but with a bunch of caveats, like this year 4, you're going to start paying us back, or you're going to not get money anymore, or you're going to get a certain amount of money from these other congregations. And it's a very complicated math problem to be an anchor congregation, and comes with a lot of assumptions about entrepreneurial style return of funds to show the success of this anchor congregation. Is that fair?
It is fair. Just a little caveat is that they're trying to get away from the model where we might say the church that has the ministries in order and is doing it's doing well, directs everything. They're trying to give more independence and more autonomy, but for the anchor church to be more of a mentor more than taking over. So that's what it has changed. I think it's a good model in that sense. But to your point, in our current reality, right, with what's going on, we're going to have to reassess, and we're going to have to obviously see how that looks. But I think it's a wonderful idea. It's a wonderful model that, as long as it's among equals, which is and that's kind of the integrity of the process to become an anchor church, requires that type of a covenantal relationship among equals, which I think is something that both as of late they have included, which is a great idea. But yeah, it's I wonder not so much about that model, but just churches in general, how we do need that honesty from our leadership, synodical, our bishop, presiding bishop, our pastors too. Like, we need to be honest and say, I think the honesty, it's going to be hard, but that honesty will get us further, because what we have seen, the unveiling that COVID-19 has done to our assumptions about possibilities and even who we are as a people, is going to affect the church. It's affecting the church.
Yeah.
So we need to continue. I think after what we have seen, lack of honesty and transparency from our secular leaders, I hope and pray we don't commit the same mistake now for in terms of mission, because we need to be honest with our pastors. We need to be honest with our the membership, the laity, in terms of the possibilities that they may have in creating a church that is sustainable in this new reality.
Well, I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for all the wisdom that you shared with us. We obviously could talk all day about these issues, and in fact have before. So maybe we'll have another conversation again in the future. But I'm so grateful that you shared this time with us and helped us to kind of think about all of the questions you raised and some of the insights that you raised. And I know I'll be praying for your cohort, your demon cohort, and for you and all that you're up to in Lodi.
No, I thank you, Pastor Megan. And can I say this?
Yeah.
So I have invited Pastor Megan to come to our march. We're going to have a silent march on October 3rd, Saturday, October 3rd at 2:00. We're going to gather at St. Paul. And this is in response to a very difficult moment that we're going through here in Lodi, where a lot of our people of color have felt the blunt of the racism from the region. The Proud Boys, some of the other militias, and who are white supremacists have come, and sadly including very aggressive Trump supporters, who have the name calling and the racial slurs that I heard in the corner of Tokay and Church Street. It was one of the corners of the church when one of the marches was coming our way, and they stopped because we had planned I would bless them. And those racial slurs that I heard and some of the attacks that I heard directed towards me, we have decided to counter it with a march that is a silent march, and then we're going to gather for a prayer vigil. So I have invited Pastor Megan to be there to have participation with some of the prayers, and at 2:00 at St. Paul, this coming Saturday, October 3rd. So I just want to thank you for saying yes to that invitation, and to show your audience that we need this relationship, this intersectionality, this common support, because we are all siblings in Christ. So thank you again, Pastor Megan.
Absolutely. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.